Then the West or the entire world came to know that Indians and a potter, uh, you know, is performing cosmetic surgery. And since they had no idea as yet how to do it, this technique became famous in the West as the Indian flap because a flap of skin was being used. And it is also called Indian rhinoplasty. It was dated to 600 to 800 BC, which means 2800 years before the present time. And the remarkable thing is that this technique of plastic surgery that I mentioned is mentioned by Sushruta himself in the Sushruta Samhita. One interesting fact about Charaka is he was kidnapped by the Koshan king Kanishka. An operation of the brain was actually done on King Bhoj when he was just 2 years old. And we get to know about this from King Bhoja's biography called the Bhoja Prabandha.
Welcome to another episode of Sangam Talks, where we journey through the forgotten lanes of ancient wisdom and rediscover the brilliance of India's scientific heritage. Today, we are diving deep into the legacy of one of the world's greatest surgeons, Shushruta. Long before modern operating rooms, anesthesia, or antiseptics, there was a time when precise surgical techniques and over 100 types of instruments were already in use, documented in Sanskrit, in a text known as the Sushruta Samhita. But how did the world forget about this ancient genius? And how was his legacy rediscovered through a rather surprising twist during British colonial times? From cosmetic surgery to cranial operations and even dental procedures dating back thousands of years, today's episode is a journey through archaeology, mythology, and medicine. We'll also touch upon the lesser known genius of Charaka and end with an extraordinary story, a brain tumor operation on a royal child, King Bhoja, that defies belief. So stay with us as we explore the science, spirit, and surgical brilliance of ancient India. Joining us today is Dr. Brishti Guha, Associate Professor of Economics from JNU. Ma'am, welcome back to
Thank
Sangam
you.
Talks. Ma'am, when we talk about Shushrut, one thing that always comes to our mind is surgery. And we say that he is the father of surgery, not only modern surgery, father of surgery of all times. So, how do we see it today, and how is this seen in the medical fraternity?
Okay, so one thing which I'll emphasize now is the connection of Sushruta with cosmetic surgery. Now, for this, we need to talk about how the Sushruta Samhita was rediscovered and how the modern world came to know about it. Okay, so for the first step of this story, we should go back in time to 1793. So at that time, two British surgeons stationed in Pune were approached by an Indian bullock cart driver named Kovasji. And Kovasji was desperate. He was crying. He said that Tipu Sultan has cut off my nose and I immediately need a nose replacement. Now, these two British surgeons were in trouble because they had absolutely no clue how to go about it. Now, somebody else was called in to do this operation and he performed the operation successfully. So, what he did is he took a flap of skin from Kovasji's forehead, he attached it to the tissue and he used it to reconstruct a nose. And the British surgeons were absolutely amazed. And they were particularly amazed because the person doing the operation was an Indian potter. And they immediately published a full account of this operation with before and after pictures of Kovasji. So then the West or the entire world came to know that Indians and a potter, uh, you know, is performing cosmetic surgery. And since they had no idea as yet how to do it, this technique became famous in the West as the Indian flap because a flap of skin was being used. and it is also called Indian rhinoplasty. Now, because it became so famous, a number of experts came in to verify the soundness of the reconstructed nose, and they found it's completely satisfactory. It works fine. So then the two British surgeons started questioning the potter. They said, "Look, you are a potter. How come you know how to do this operation?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm a potter, but we also know this. So, in our family, this knowledge of cosmetic surgery has been passed down through many generations." Okay, so now we come to tracing the original source of this knowledge. So, we go to the next step in our story, and for that, we have to fast forward to 1888. Okay, so that's nearly 100 years after Kovacsky's operation. So, at that time, Britain and Russia were both rivals. They were both trying to control Central Asia. And there was a British agent named Andrew Dalglish who just doubled as a Scottish merchant. So he was making a regular trading trip from Leh to Central Asia, and he was crossing the Karakoram Pass. At that point, he was joined by a Pathan trader named Dad Muhammad. So Dad Muhammad suddenly murdered Dalglish one night and ran away. Now the British suspected that this Dad Muhammad is actually a Russian agent. And so they hired another officer named Hamilton Bower, and they told him, "Go after this murderer and try to catch him." So then Hamilton Bower spends the next 2 years near the Karakoram trying to track down this murderer. And in the process, he comes to a mountain range called the Tien Shan Mountains, which is very near the Taklamakan Desert. And then he is approached by a man who wants to sell him an ancient manuscript. So he sees this manuscript is on birch bark and the script is Brahmi. So then Bauer bought the manuscript, which became known as the Bauer manuscript, and he brought it back with him to India, and he gave it to the Royal Asiatic Society to translate. Now, once it was translated, the world was stunned because they found that in this manuscript, people are talking about an ancient Indian surgeon named Sushruta, and they are full of praise for him. So then people became very curious. They said, "Who is this Sushruta, and why is a manuscript found in such a remote location mentioning him? And that too in glowing terms." Okay, so then we come to the final key in the puzzle, and this is the manuscript of the Sushruta Samhita. So because now people were curious, they saw that okay, actually this manuscript exists, and then they started trying to find the date of the manuscript, and it was dated to 600 to 800 BC, which means 2800 years before the present time. And the remarkable thing is that this technique of plastic surgery that I mentioned is mentioned by Sushruta himself in the Sushruta Samhita. In fact, to be more accurate, Sushruta is using a method called the cheek flap because he is recommending that the skin should be taken from the cheek and should be used to reconstruct the nose. So he goes into a lot of detail what to do before the operation and what to do afterwards. For example, temporarily you have to insert pipes into the two nostrils. Okay, so for people who are curious, you can look at chapter 16 of Sutrasthanam in the Sushruta Samhita. Okay, so what we see here is that we had ancient Indians had cosmetic surgery 2800 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Ma'am, so in that case, it was definitely sure that Sushruta used several surgical instruments at those times, right? Because to perform a surgery in these days also, we require so many surgical procedures, so many surgical instruments. So what were the instruments that was used by him? And as mentioned in Sushruta, if you could throw some light on those.
Yes, so in fact, Sushruta is famous for the huge variety of surgical instruments which he himself invented. Okay, so he used or he'd invented more than 100 different types of surgical instruments, and some of these can be seen on the slide. And so he was extremely particular, about what kind of opening a different an instrument should have, what kind of thing it should be tempered with, okay, which means what kind of disinfectant should we use to sterilize that instrument. And I should also mention that he invented a special brush which was made of bamboo and grass. And at the same time, he invented a technique for decomposing a dead body in water. And then he would use that special brush to very carefully scrape off the tissues layer by layer. So, the purpose of this is that he wanted to study anatomy, he wanted to see the exact structure and layout of organs, and he wanted to show this to his students. So, he was very strong on trying to teach surgery and teach anatomy medicine.
Okay. How do archaeological findings from Lothal and Mehragarh show the surgical improvisations that were present in ancient India?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked this question. So I will discuss Lothal first, and this is because we sometimes think that brain surgery or operations on the skull might also have started with Sushruta. In reality, they far predated Sushruta. Okay, so I've mentioned Sushruta's date was around 800 BC. Now, if we look at the field report of the Lothal excavation, okay, by S.R. Rao, then we find, so these skeletons which they were looking at in Lothal were from 3000 BC, which means 5000 years before now. So in the field report, they mention that they're studying all of the skeletons in a lot of detail. And there they find a skeleton of a 9-year-old child, and they find evidence of trepanning. So trepanning means that a surgeon drills a hole in the skull, and it's done with the purpose of extracting something from the cranial cavity. So that could be a tumor, or it could be that some sort of wound has happened in the head, maybe due to an arrow, okay, arrowhead. So some foreign matter may be lodged and it needs to be taken out. But unfortunately, with regard to the Lothal surgery, the archaeologists concluded that this child did not survive that surgery by more than a few days. So, these surgeries would have been extremely risky at that time, and they would only be undertaken if there's an emergency. So, probably the condition of the child was so bad that these particular surgeons were unable to save the child's life. Okay, now this uh, brain surgery continued into later times, and surgeons kept trying to improve on their techniques. So this also finds a mention with Sushruta, because he explains that the bones surrounding the brain cavity may sustain injury, and there may be trauma to the head, and you might need to open up the skull in that case. In fact, Sushruta's treatment of brain surgery is described in detail in an article published in the journal World Neurosurgery. This is Banerjee et al. 2011. So you can refer to that for details of how Sushruta was performing these brain surgeries. Okay, now about dental surgery and Mehergarh. Okay, so Mehergarh is a site which is even older than most of the IBC sites, and the information I am giving you dates back to 7000 BC, that is 9000 years ago. Okay, so what archaeologists discovered is they examined 9000-year-old skeletons, and they found 11 teeth which show evidence of dental drilling. And there has actually been a study published about this in the journal Nature in 2006. So what they mention there is that these dental surgeries seem to have worked very well, because there's evidence that people kept using these teeth even after they were drilled through. So they were using them normally, they were chewing food. So nothing bad happened as a result of the surgery. In fact, they were working well. And they also mention something else which is very interesting. So they say that in Mehergarh there was a tradition of making beads. Okay, so carnelian beads, lapis lazuli beads, and they say that the same sort of skills which can lead to bead making can also lead to the development of dental surgery. And
Like drilling, for example.
yeah, so you need to make very small holes in these beads because you need to actually pass a string through the beads. So that same skill will teach you how to do dental drilling. So that's a really interesting hypothesis which they put forward. And dental surgery also continues into Sushruta's times because Sushruta talks about that as well.
Ma'am, you spoke about Indian rhinoplasty, which means that the particular surgery which was done or performed on the the soldier whose name was Kovas ji. So when we say that, so are there also other methods that are still existing, which was as practiced by Sushruta or as prescribed in Sushruta Samhita?
You mean about rhinoplasty itself?
Apart from that, are there any other, or like precisely I'm asking,
Hmm.
like are there surgery procedures that was practiced then but are also still practiced nowadays?
Okay, so I mean, I would say that the operations themselves are still practiced, but obviously the procedures would have been changed or refined. So, one difference, for example, would be the use of anesthetic. So, Sushruta was also using anesthetics. Okay, for example, he was using different ones. So, he uses sometimes somras and some wine, for example, but they didn't have the same type of anesthetics which we would use today in a modern surgical operation.
Why is it significant that surgery was so systematized in India at a time when many civilizations, no, they had, in fact, it was forbidden for them to even open the body,
Yeah.
right? I mean, in fact, we hear about stories wherein physicians in ancient India, they learn by dissecting the dead bodies. But at that same time, it was forbidden in many civilizations to do that. So, how are we different when it comes to such practices?
Okay, so in fact, Sushruta really encouraged his students to learn how to dissect dead bodies. So first, there are passages in the Sushrut Samhita on this. So he says that, we can practice on various things. For example, on various fruits and vegetables like gourds. And they used to make dummies and practice on those. Then whenever, they actually found a corpse because we didn't always have cremations. We also sometimes had burials, especially if somebody died when they are under 2 years old, then they were not cremated. They used to be buried. So whenever there was a corpse available to him, I mentioned that technique he had of decomposing the corpse in water and scraping off the tissues so that they could study it. And then, they would even go to yagyas where animal sacrifice was happening because then they would be able to see the all the bones properly and they would be able to engage in dissection as well. So they did not let any opportunity slip. Okay. And this probably, is connected with the fact that even before Sushruta, there was a very rich tradition of surgery. For example, in Vedic times, if you read the Rig Veda, you will find that limb replacement surgeries were common. For example, there's this woman warrior called Vishpala who loses her entire leg as a result of a battle, and she goes and gets her leg replaced, and it's replaced by an iron leg. So there was this technique whereby you could, if your arm or your leg gets cut off during warfare, you can get it replaced, and it was usually initially it was made of iron, and in later times it was substituted with other metals. So sometimes silver was also used. Okay, so I think the fact that, by Sushruta's time, there had already been such a rich tradition of surgery, and uh, it was also very important in connection with war because he also has a passage specifically on army surgeons. So I think it was always considered very important. And as you saw in Kowasji's story, that later on, the family which had this knowledge, they were actually not officially doctors or officially surgeons. Their official occupation was being a potter. And now I think this connects with the other part of your question, because you mentioned that in many societies it was completely forbidden to even open a dead body. So yeah, that I agree with that. So that reminds me both of Korea and of Europe. So in Korea, there were some people who practiced surgery, but they had to do it in secret, because if they were found, they would actually be executed. So, for some reason, there was a complete ban on performing surgery. And even in medieval Europe, so like these times I'm talking about would be actually medieval times, like post 12th century AD. So in medieval Europe also there was a like hostile feeling against surgery at that time, and anyone who knew it, they basically had to learn it from the Middle East, and the Arabs had learned it, partly from us. But they were in a position where they had to hide the fact that they knew surgery. And they used to do, so many of them actually, they had to restrict themselves just to casting horoscopes for patients. So that's something they did in the West. They would, instead of actually treating them, they would cast a horoscope for them, and they would say that the horoscope is predicting the health of the patient. Or, they would use bloodletting, which means they're just bleeding the patient. So there were all these restrictions in the West. Now, in our country, although these restrictions were not there, it seems that in the medieval times at least, in a parallel period of time, it went underground, in the sense that there were like this Potter family, they were doing this somewhat secretly, in the sense that they knew they're doing it, and people also knew, local people who lived near them, they knew that these people are doing it. But probably someone who lives in a completely different city would not know of it. And the westernized intellectuals or even the westernized Indians might not even know that this still existed. So that's why it had to be rediscovered. No? Yeah.
So when we talk about Sushruta
Hmm.
and his contribution to surgery, it's definitely not possible to keep away the role played by Charaka. So tell me something about Charaka.
Okay, so Charaka wrote another book called the Charaka Samhita. And one interesting fact about Charaka is he was kidnapped by the Koshan king Kanishka. Okay, so Kanishka ruled over in parts of India between the 2nd and the 1st century BC. So this also gives us a date for Charaka, that Charaka also lived around that time. And the story is that Charaka had come to treat Kanishka's wife, and he was able to cure her successfully. And Kanishka was so happy by this that he said that I'm not letting this guy go. So he forces him to stay with them. Okay, then something interesting about the content of the Charak Samhita. So Charaka actually gives advice to medical students who are thinking of how do we choose a supervisor. And this was a very important decision, because once they choose a supervisor, they can't change him and they have to obey all of his instructions, and they are completely under his thumb. Okay, so Charaka actually gives them advice, and he says don't rush into this choice. Observe the potential supervisors for some time, and you can look at them when they are performing operations, and you can, for example, see are their hands shaking. Okay, because you want somebody whose hands are steady, so that they're able to perform surgeries effectively. Then he says that look at how they behave if their operation fails. Do they start blaming their students? If they do, then don't choose that person as a guide. Okay. So, and another thing, of course, is relevant now, because a lot of institutions are considering replacing the Hippocratic Oath by the Charaka Oath.
That is there. That is there. And even in the modern MBBS syllabus also, we see the role played by Sushruta in surgery is reflected in the academics. And this particular story, it's not a story, it's a reality history. The surgery commenced by Kumar, the potter, on Kovasji. That is a part of their syllabus also. So this is a great change in the MBBS syllabus as such, in wherein we are trying to learn our own history first. Ma'am, so we also come to learn about the brain surgery done on King Bhoja. Please tell something about that.
Okay. So, yeah, so as I mentioned, brain surgery was gradually becoming more successful, and it started back in the times of the IVC, and then it was continuing into Sushruta's time, but it kept improving. So, by the time we get to King Bhoja was an early 11th century AD king, and he ruled over parts of central India. And well, he's now more in the news due to Bhojshala. The incident is that an operation of the brain was actually done on King Bhoj when he was just 2 years old. And we get to know about this from King Bhoja's biography called the Bhoja Prabandha. Okay, so it happened like this, that when he was a very small child, he was prone to intense headaches. So nobody knew why he is getting such bad headaches. Then a pair of brothers from Ujjain who were surgeons, they came and examined him. And they said that he is having these headaches because he actually has a brain tumor. So then they gave him an anesthetic powder called Moha Churna. So he lost consciousness. Then they opened up his brain cavity and they did find a tumor there. So then they removed the tumor, they sewed him up and they restored him to consciousness, giving him another powder called Sanjeevani. So we know that this operation must have been spectacularly successful because not only did Bhoja survive, but he lived the normal lifespan and he became a genius. So, it's almost as if taking away that tumor made him more intelligent than average. So, he was a polymath and he wrote on every subject you can think of, from architecture to poetics to yoga to grammar. And he sponsored very practical projects such as building dams. And he also set up an institute where even the poorest subjects like weavers could learn about Sanskrit poetical meter. So I would say this is a grand success story of brain surgery.
So that, ma'am, these incidents of being recorded in his own biography about the surgical procedure which he himself underwent as a child, that really reflects the tradition or the legacy of India's history when it comes to surgery or internal medicine, etc., etc. Ma'am, and one more thing is, like, we see that it took so many centuries together. After having such a centuries together of history over medicine, over internal medicine, surgical procedures, but still during the colonial period, there was a time wherein things were undermined. Things were like not brought into light the real sense it should be. So again, we would say that it's the implication of colonial British colonialism which we had on our own system. And there was a time wherein the British forced the Ayurvedic physicians or the Siddha Vaidyas to stop practicing these practices of traditional medicines, wherein the entry was given to allopathic medicines in India. So it's a fact to show that British policies, it actually undermined the practices of traditional medicines in India, and wherein high price was given as salary to practitioners of allopathy. So we have this as a history today. But now, during the COVID, the entire globe saw traditional medicines as one thing that is preventive, there's precautionary, there are immunity boosters. So what are your views on this? How has the tradition or how has the scenario changed post-COVID?
Hmm. So I think this is probably it's going to have a positive effect because, as you mentioned, people have seen the effects of traditional medicine. So let's hope it has a positive effect. But another thing which would help is if we knew more about our medical and surgical legacy. Okay, by the way, when I was mentioning that surgery went underground for a while, right? So one reason which could be associated with that is also due to foreign invasions, because you see people who had very specific talents, they were always afraid of being kidnapped for their talents and being used by the wrong people. Okay, so for example, these surgeons might have felt that they'll get used by foreign rulers or despots whom they don't want to work for. So they hate the fact that they knew these things, right? Otherwise, there's no reason why, you know, a family would hide the fact that we are a family of surgeons and they'll say we are a family of potters. And they actually, even in actual practice, they had to do both. Okay, so I think this was one fact which made it go underground. And as I may have mentioned, that when we started learning more English education, which happened after the English Education Act of 1835, we also forgot that we know these things, partly because this traditional knowledge was kept very secret. So if we were living in another part of the country, we don't know about a local family which might have nurtured this knowledge. And the British were continuously also telling us that, you don't know anything of value, and everything which is useful is coming to you from the West. And we bought into it.
Post the WTO, formation of WTO, a great emphasis was given on traditional medicine knowledge in trying to understand the methods of medicines practiced in the ancient civilizations, and gradually patents were also given to the compounds extracted from those herbs, from those plants and all. And one biggest example that has great implications for India is the patent given to turmeric, wherein the compound called curcumin, it was patented, and later on the CSIR had a very tough battle to be fought at the US Patent Office. And later on, when they found out that this particular curcumin and its uses, it's a prior art, that is when the patent was cancelled to it. And then again the same thing happened to neem, the same thing happened to several other traditional medicines. So that is when the CSIR formed the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, TKDL, wherein they have agreement with US Patent Office, European Patent Office, Japanese Patent Office, etc. And any time whenever the species or the product or the patenting product has its origin from India, they are expected to come and check in this library. And if at all they find this to be a prior art, then patent is not to be given. So
Oh, that's
as
nice.
such a great measure was taken thereafter, and now the patents that is being given to traditional medicines has decreased gradually. But are we in a position to understand that the modern R&D for allopathic medicines has its roots also in medicines that are practiced in India? There are so many examples which we come across when we go through the TKDL digital library, and we see that so many patents have been applied, many are in progress, and later on several of them, because the knowledge was already known to other civilizations, and there is no novelty in it, there is nothing new in it to be patented, and therefore the patents were cancelled. So we live in a generation, we live in a time wherein guarding the traditional knowledge from getting privatized, from getting commercialized itself is a big job these days.
Yeah.
And we also have a generation like those who belong to Sushruta Charaka, wherein they didn't own the knowledge. They said these knowledge were given to us by our ancestors, and it is our role, it's our duty to give it back to the next generations, so that these remain as open source of knowledge and can be accessed by the next generations for the benefit of welfare. So ma'am, thank you very much for your time, and we had a great discussion here on Sushruta and Charaka. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Namaste.